Welcome to the Kindling's Muse podcast, an intelligent, imaginative, hospitable exploration of ideas that matter in contemporary life. And now, here's your host, Dick Staub.
Well, welcome everybody. I'm Dick Staub, and I want to welcome you to the Kindling's Muse at Earl Palmer Ministries. This event is taped in front of a live and lively audience at Kane Hall on the campus of the University of Washington. Go Huskies. Reverend Earl Palmer selects a book every thinking Christian ought to read. And this show was born because I attended Berkeley Presbyterian Church back in the dark ages when I was young. And every Sunday I would go as a student and hear him preach, and I'd come out with like a list of 5 books that I needed to read. So when he said, what kind of podcast could we do? I said, let's just do the books that you think we ought to read and just talk about them. And I've loved this show because it gives me a good reading list and a reminder list, and it creates good opportunities for conversation and learning. Tonight, we're going to be talking about how to study the Bible, and we're going to do this through the lens of C.S. Lewis's classic book, An Experiment in Criticism. We'll get a chance to hear Dr. Palmer, then I'll have a chance to talk to him for a bit, and then we'll get to the audience questions. So let's get going with a great evening. Will you join me in welcoming Reverend Earl Palmer?
Well, I want to start my story in Berkeley, California, where we first met. I was a sophomore at the University of California, and at I think January of my sophomore year, a friend of mine, Arba Hudgens, we were both living in a dorm together, Barrington Hall, and it was a co-op, and he invited me to come and attend a Bible study group that he was a part of. I didn't even have a Bible. It's amazing. I came from a wonderful family, and we went to church quite a bit when I was a kid. But when I went to college, I became really just a secular young man, and I didn't think I needed to bring a Bible with me to go to Cal. And so I said, yeah, I would like to come to that Bible study group. And I did. The first week, they met, these are guys my own age, and I had to look on with somebody. And so then that week I went out and bought a Bible for myself. I went to the Sather Gate bookstore, and a little insight into my personality. For $1 extra, they would print my name on it. So I have my name printed on this Bible, and I still have that wonderful Bible. And I went the next week, now with my own Bible with my name on it, and attended the Bible study group. That turned out to be a very life-changing experience in my life. I went to that little group. I through that group, and week by week, studying the New Testament. Then I met other Christians that were in that group at Barrington, and then at the church they went to, the First Presbyterian Church of Berkeley, which was just 1 block from where I was a student, where I lived in that dorm. And then started to attend the First Presbyterian Church. That summer turned out to be a very big summer in my life because they had a retreat. They had a retreat at Lake Tahoe. Edward John Carnell was one of the speakers, and the other speaker was Robert Boyd Munger, the pastor of First Pres. And at that conference, the pieces of the puzzle came together for me. I'll never forget the one way that Dr. Munger put it. He said, when on the basis of what you know about Jesus Christ, you're willing to trust in his trustworthiness, then you're ready to become a Christian. And I can still remember lying on the dock at this conference center, looking at Lake Tahoe, and I said to myself, on the basis of what I have seen about Jesus Christ and what I know about him now, I trust him, and I want to trust him. And I decided to put my weight down and claim the promises and claim who he is. And so I became a believer. Then everything took off for me in my life as far as that Bible study group. Went back to Berkeley, got very active in the college group at First Pres, also the Bible study group. We invited guys from our dorm. We were in a co-op that was a rather radical hall, and we would put a little notice up about our Bible study group, and every week it would be defaced, and cruel things would be written on the Bible, on the notice, but we kept replacing it, kept making a new notice. It's where I learned how to handle graffiti. The key on graffiti is get rid of it immediately and put the proper notice up. So we kept putting the proper notice up. But we finally, guys came. One after another, guys would come to our Bible study group. We saw a lot of guys became believers through that Bible study group and through the college group at university, at First Press. And then 2 years later, from that first encounter, I went to Dr. Munger and I said, I think I'd like to be a minister. Now, that's about as deep as my understanding of what it meant to be a pastor was. But I realized that I enjoyed that Bible study group. I got to know the college pastor. I said to myself, I'd like to work with college students myself. And so Dr. Munger said, well, you have to apply to seminary. I did. I applied to Princeton Seminary. That next fall, I went to Princeton Seminary, and the rest is history. It was a Renaissance experience for me. It was a great school. I made so many friends there. And then a very interesting thing happened about 4 weeks into my time at Princeton. We were sent out as juniors to sort of represent the seminary and maybe show the flag for Princeton, and they would send us down to a church. We would maybe participate on Saturday night in a youth gathering, and then on Sunday we would share in worship and read scripture and do various parts of the worship service, not preach, but just give a witness for Princeton and then just show the flag. And on that particular day at Jenkinstown, we were farmed out to families. I was farmed out to a family named the Kellys. That's their name. And they had a son named Glenn Kelly. He was a freshman at Princeton University. I'm over at Princeton Seminary. They're right next door to each other. And Glenn hadn't gone to the youth party the night before, and he hadn't gone to church that day. He was not particularly, wasn't interested really in going to church at that point. So, but we talked. And we especially were talking about the rooms we lived in. And he said, you should see my room and my roommates. They're really wild. Princeton was an all-male school in those days. Now it's calmed down. But he said, he was telling me about his roommates and his dorm. And so he said, would you like to see my roommates and see my room? And I said, yes. So the next week, I went over to Princeton University, just across a couple of blocks from where I was, and I went to his room, and they were all his friends. They were there, and it was a kind of a wild place. And for some reason, I just said to him, I said, when I was at Berkeley, I was in a small Bible study group in my dorm where I was, and it was just guys my own age reading the text of New Testament books, and sometimes we'd read Old Testament books like the Psalms or something like that. We just met for an hour, and I loved it. And I don't have a group like that now. And if you guys would be interested, I'd be willing to meet with you once a week if you'd like. And I'll never forget, Glenn Kelly got everybody quiet. He said, quiet everybody. Mr. Palmer is from the seminary. He's willing to help us with the Bible study group. Would you like to do it? And for some reason, they said yes. So I started meeting once a week with these guys. The interesting thing was, that was the first Bible study group at Princeton that I started. From then on, various guys in other dorms and other living situations asked if I would come and work with their Bible study group as well. At one point, I had 5 of these going. In fact, Princeton Seminary made an exception for me in my senior year that I didn't have to have a field ed where you go out to a church and do field ed, because they call that my field ed, because I ended up being so involved with these Bible study groups, and just once a week I would meet with these guys, and it had a tremendous impact on me, and it also had a good impact on these guys, because I never tried to make it evangelistic or anything like that, but I would just, the closest I would come is I would say, if anybody wants to talk about any of this stuff, let me know. And guys would say, hey, can I talk to you? And we would talk, and I saw those guys one by one. Glenn Kelly himself became a terrific Christian guy. And one by one, guys would become Christians. And I wasn't even trying to make that happen. but it turned out to be a very, very impressive and important experience in my life. And when I look back on it, I realized it became very formative to me in terms of my strategy of ministry when I finally did get out of Princeton and started to be a pastor, starting actually at University Presbyterian Church in Seattle. That was my first post as a youth pastor. And again, what happened there is that I saw the tremendous impact of a group of young men and young women that would simply look at the text of the New Testament and read it week by week, or you're just doing it by yourself, reading the text and letting the text make its own point, reading it as amateurs. Though I was a student at the seminary, but wasn't really an expert, but we were really an amateur group. That's what we were at Berkeley. We were an amateur group, reading the text like you'd read any other book. And that's the way I kind of styled it. Read this book like any other book. You don't have to give it anything ahead of time. You don't have to say, this is the Word of God. Don't do that. Just read it like you'd read anything, and let it win its way with you if it can. I figured some weeks Paul won, some weeks he lost with the group, depending on whether they liked what he said or didn't like what he said. But it's amazing. What I found is that given time, sooner or later, wherever we read, whatever we read, whether it was the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, or the book of Acts, the study of the early church, or the letters, or the Old Testament, whatever we read, I found that sooner or later, the text would always bring us to the Lord of the text, would always bring us to the center of the text, who is Jesus Christ. The Old Testament by anticipation, the New Testament in witness, would always bring you to its center. And what I found out was that center, when you discover the Jesus that you meet in the text, the Jesus of the New Testament, the Jesus that the Old Testament longs for, that the messianic yearning of the Old, the New Testament witness to the man, Jesus of Nazareth, he would win your respect. And I found out that respect is not too far away from faith. It's where it begins, respect. He wins your respect. And I saw the power of letting a text just speak and read it step by step and see it all unfold right in front of your eyes. When I look back on how powerful that was, I realized what was happening was that these words were being read by ordinary people, and discoveries were being made by the reader as the text unfolded itself. That's better than a leader telling you God's love. What's better is if you can see for yourself in the text that love coming out of the text. I see it myself now. That's better than a pastor, even an inspirational one, telling you about the love, or telling you about the hope that that pastor may have, or the hope that you could have if you were a believer. This is now a different experience. It's discovery within the text itself that an ordinary person can have, and then that becomes a much more powerful basis for faith. And what I discovered in that is that really I'm reading a book and letting the book make its own point. It's interesting to me that the last book that C.S. Lewis, beloved C.S. Lewis, beloved in my life and maybe your life, but the last book Lewis wrote when he was professor at Cambridge, published in 1961. There was one book published later that was published right after his death, Letters to Malcolm, Chiefly in Prayer. But his last official book, he started the book off by saying, I'm writing this essay about how to read a book. And of course, the essay became the book, Experiment in Criticism. A brilliant book. In my opinion, Experiment in Criticism is probably the best book on Bible study I've ever read. And it's not a book about Bible study. It's a book about how to read a book, how to let a book make its own point. And I'll read what Lewis says. He says, we must begin, this is quoting now from Experiment and Criticism, we must begin by laying aside as completely as we can all of our own preconceptions, our own interests, our own associations. We must use our eyes. We must look and go on looking till we have certainly seen exactly what's there. The first demand any work of art or any, whether it's a painting or a book, makes upon us is look, listen, receive. Get yourself out of the way. This is a very main theme that Lewis has throughout Experiment and Criticism. He makes the point a little later when he's talking about poems and talking about stories, because he has a whole section here on stories. He says, in a story, you have to let the story flow over you. You have to let it just flow over you without too quickly needing to make an interpretation or to explain it. Let it flow over you. And then he even puts it this way, you have to risk being taken in. You have to risk when you read a story and let it make its own mark. In other words, get yourself out of the way. In fact, he creates a parable. It's a parable from maybe soccer. He says there are two kinds of soccer players. There's the serious man who plays soccer. The serious man who plays soccer plays it because it has exercise value and it has aerobic value for strengthening his body. But that's not a serious soccer player. A serious soccer player plays it for the love of the game. And it's the game that has intoxicated him, not so that he can get something from the game. In other words, he doesn't go with an agenda to the game. He goes to the game and it captivates him. It's the joy of the game. And he says that is the serious soccer player. He may not be the serious man who plays soccer. He's the serious soccer player who happens to be a man or a woman. And he uses that as sort of a parable to make his point. But this getting myself out of the way, allowing a text to make its own point. We call this exposition of a text. The exposition of a text, the discovery of what a text is saying, of what the Bible is actually saying. And without overloading it with grids or things that you expect or want to see, first, just let it make its own point. And in my opinion, this has three very good values for the benefit that comes from it. First, it has a great value in terms of discovery of the ethics of the New Testament. And the ethical impact of the New Testament or the Old Testament is to let the text make its ethical point as it's there, not because I'm looking for the ethical point that I want to find there. But when you're reading and you're going through a Bible study, letting a text make its point, and then I find a great ethical breakthrough, then that ethical breakthrough is found by myself. It's not, so to speak, told by a teacher who's now impressing it upon the text and wants me to see. That's the great value of discovery of a great teaching about, for instance, how to use money. That's better than, say, a pastor that says, now I'm going to give you a sermon on how to use money. Now we're looking for that in the text. We don't really discover it in the text. The pastor has already coded our reading of the text. I want you now to look for this. And so you're looking for something ahead of time. It's like the serious man who plays soccer. It's not the serious soccer player. The serious soccer player makes the discovery of the joy of the game in the playing of the game, in the reading of the book. I discover great ethical teachings. And they come as I just am en route through the material. The same thing is true in evangelism. For the pastor or the Christian that wants to share their faith, the best way to have the faith shared interpersonally is, again, the value of a text, the value of the New Testament simply pointing us to Jesus Christ, bringing us to him naturally en route as we're simply reading the text and we discover his person, we discover his character, we discover his greatness as we find it, not because someone previously gets us ready for it. We simply find it. It's just there when we're reading the text. And this is also true for theology. The best theology, and I think this experience with just a group of friends of mine at Berkeley and my friends that I had at Princeton, and where we did just simply Bible study together, looking at various books of the New Testament, had a very good effect on me theologically. It made me willing and ready to be a biblical theologian before I was a systematic theologian. I think systematic theology, the danger of it is that I decide a great doctrinal truth that I want to find, and now I'm going to read it in to the text. So the text sort of has to support the systematic or the theoretical framework that I've already put. This has happened a lot of times with a lot of harm that happens when we decide ahead of time what is the theology we want to find, and then the systematic theology dominates the biblical theology. But the best theology, it seems to me, starts with the Bible, starts with letting it make its point, and then the point is validated. And we then discover the grand themes, and there are grand themes that come out of the text, but it's better if we can discover them ourselves. Those of you in the Kindling's Muse know that I love Fyodor Dostoevsky, and in fact, 3 or 4 Kindling's Muses ago, we actually looked at his great book, Crime and Punishment, and looked at grace and truth in Crime and Punishment. We did look in that novel and saw some great themes as Dostoevsky brought them forth. In The Brothers Karamazov, he does the same thing with the Bible in a beautiful way. He creates a character named Father Zosima. And Father Zosima is a very good man. He's a priest, a Russian Orthodox priest in a monastery. And the youngest of the 3 brothers, of the brothers Karamazov, Alosha, becomes very devoted to him and becomes a pupil of Father Zosima. And that becomes a very major part of this story. And at one point, Dostoevsky has a long section where Father Zosima is giving advice and giving counsel and helping people who come for help. And it's Dostoevsky's way of teaching and getting his own, you might say, points of view across within this novel. One of the best parts is when a group of young priests come to Father Zosima, and Dostoevsky puts these words in the mouth of Father Zosima to these priests. The priests have come very, very upset because they're virtually starving with lack of salary in the Russian Orthodox parishes where they're serving. And Father Zosima says, "Friends and teachers, I have often heard recently more frequently than ever that our priests, particularly the rural ones, are bitterly claiming that their meager subsistence and humble positions is harming them. And I have read it myself, that apparently due to their low stipend, they are no longer able to interpret the Holy Scriptures to the people." And then he has, this is hilarious for us to hear this part. "And if heretics and Lutherans then come and lure away their flock, they say, so be it." In other words, a terrible thing for the Russian Orthodox if the Lutherans would come and steal members of their flocks. And he says, if that happens, so be it, because our stipend is so low. Our salaries are so low. And then I love Father Zosima. He's such a gentle man. "Lord, I think let them have more of that subsistence, which is so precious to them." He says, "I'm hoping they get more money. For their complaint is justified indeed. After all, they're very poor. But verily I say unto you, if any blame has to be apportioned for this, half of it is ours, because their salaries are so low. Let us suppose that they have no time, that they are right in claiming that they are weighed down all the time with work and official church duties, but surely they're not weighed down all the time. Now, this is the part I like. They're not all the time weighed down, for even they must have at least 1 hour out of the whole week when they could think about God. Nor can they be working all the year round either. So one evening a week to begin with, let them gather, and this is the part I like, let them gather the children around them, and the fathers will hear of it, and they too will start coming. By the way, when I left after being the youth pastor here for 8 years at University Press and went to Manila, I figured out that the way to get at these tough nuts, which were the men in the Union Church of Manila, because they were all so busy with their corporations or they were working and all, is I would start with their kids. And I started by having Bible study groups with the kids. And we were meeting early in the morning too. And I began to, at parties, men would come up to me and say, how do you get my son out at 7 in the morning to go to that Bible study you've got? And I also did studies in C.S. Lewis's studies, and they read other books too, but it started with Bible studies. And I said, well, you know, I do it. And by the way, I'm going to have one for just men. Would you be willing to come? And I got these guys started coming to Bible studies because they're kids, just like Dostoevsky says. So he says, start with the children, and the fathers will hear of it, and they will start coming too. And there is no need to build a mansion for this either. Simply invite them into your house. Don't worry, they won't make a mess of your house. They'll only be with you for an hour. See, the key to a Bible study group is just, it should only be an hour. It should never go overtime. If it goes overtime, people will say, oh, I'm so glad we had a great discussion today. But next week when they're thinking about, should I go? They'll say, oh man, I better not go because sometimes we go an hour and a half, 2 hours, and I can't get my work done. Always, I was very clear on that with every Bible study group I ever did. In fact, I started doing that with sessions when I was moderator of session, that we had to end on time, right, Clark? That's a very strict rule I had. We have to end on time, because if you go overtime, they'll penalize you for that. So he says, it's only an hour. And open this book, the Bible, and start reading to them in simple language and without conceit. He's talking about being amateurs when you read, even though you're a priest, a pastor, or what. But warmly and humbly, without elevating yourself above them. Just enjoy reading them the well-beloved text and take pleasure in their listening to you and understanding you. And I love this next line. Pause once in a while to explain an odd word which may be beyond the grasp of simple folk. And, you know, it is true. C.S. Lewis has a line in Experiment in Criticism. He says, tell me what the hard words mean, and you've done more for me than 1,000 commentaries. And I learned from Lewis that I should take my Greek and my Hebrew very seriously because I want to know what the words mean. I got that from Lewis, but also Dostoevsky. What do the words mean? Be sure you know what the words mean. And that's just letting the text make its own point. But be sure you understand the words and what they're there. And you don't have to be a Greek scholar to do that. Just have 5 translations in front of you, and you'll be alerted by the translators as to what the words are and what maybe are the hard words. So pause to explain an odd word which may be beyond the grasp of simple folk. But don't worry, they'll understand it all, and truly believing hearts will understand everything. And then the last line, I'm talking merely out of happiness and excitement. Forgive my tears, for I so love this book. Dostoevsky, he's talking about the Bible. The Bible is a book you can love when you read it.
Well, fascinating. We're talking about how to read the Bible, and we're looking at it through the lens of C.S. Lewis' Experiment in Criticism. This is Dick Staub. You're listening to Kindling's Muse at Earl Palmer Ministries, and we're going to be back with more right after this. right, this is Dick Staub, and I want to thank you for joining us tonight for the Kindlings Muse at Earl Palmer Ministries live at the University of Washington. And we're having a great conversation about a really important subject. And I loved hearing those early stories of how you first got interested in studying the Word. And you said it says something about a person if they have their name imprinted on the front of the Bible. What does it say about a person?
Well, it was only $1 more. I got my name on there. But I didn't tell the second half of the story. And I came to the Bible study group the next week, and I said, I've got a Bible now to join in with the group. And they said, oh, that's really nice. That's the King James. We're using the RSV. And that's the honest truth.
So because you didn't print it, you couldn't return it.
No, I didn't return it. I still have it. I treasure it because I love the King James Version. But I went out and bought an RSV paperback for the next...
And no gold imprint embossed on the paperback?
The beginning of many editions of the Bible that I've had.
One of the things that I commonly run into with people is because they view Scripture as Holy Scripture, because they view it as revealed by God, they feel it is a book unlike any other book. Therefore, it should be read differently from other books. And should the Bible be read differently from other books? When you talk about the experiment in criticism and you talk about receiving the text, that's very refreshing. I think that's not always easy for people to grasp.
Yeah. I do have very definite opinions on that question. I think it should be read like any other book. In fact, I do not. I think it is. It contaminates the well. If I say, now, the way you read this, you must read it with great reverence as you read this. No. In fact, did you notice, even the Father Zosima is so down to earth. He says, read it. They will love it. They will discover it. And then he said, I love this book. Good. But he doesn't, I think it's very important to read it like you'd read any other book. In fact, when Karl Barth wrote his commentary on Romans, and his commentary on Romans is where he really became a strong believer himself. He had the same experience Luther did with the book of Romans. It literally captured him for Christ. But when he wrote it in the first edition, and it was published, some people criticized it, scholars, and said, you are a biblicist. You are worshiping this book, because he was so taken by the argument that St. Paul made, and he was so impressed with it. And Barth answered it in a wonderful way in the third edition. When he wrote an introduction for each edition. And in the third edition, he wrote this. He says, for those who accuse me of being a biblicist, you cannot do it. All you could accuse me of is this: I read the Bible with equal seriousness with which I read my own thoughts. That's all I did. The Bible did the rest. It's what captivated me. I didn't go to it and decide this is the holy word of God, therefore I must handle it with great care. No, read it like you'd read any book. Let it win its way with you. It has to earn the right to be heard, just like anything else has to earn the right to be heard. It has to prove to be, and then where you'll have certain passages that'll be very difficult passages, and then maybe later passages will redeem earlier passages. For instance, the vengeful Psalms by David. What do you do with those very bad Psalms? He wants people murdered to the second and third generation. Well, that's impossible. If you've murdered the first, how can you murder him? How can you have him killed to the second and third generation? And he is so angry that he's getting all that venom out in those Psalms. What do you do with that Psalm? Do you say, okay, now here's a good Psalm we'll use when we go to war? No. If you see the Psalm as getting you ready to meet the Lord of the Psalm, who you will meet in the New Testament, and the book of Psalms are the most quoted part in the New Testament. So the New Testament is fulfilling those Psalms. They're seen as fulfilling them. Now, the vengeful Psalms are fulfilled later. They bother you for a long time. In fact, there are vengeful passages in the Old Testament that bother you for a long time until you realize that in the New Testament, Jesus Christ, and they were even hinted at it in the Old Testament in Isaiah, that another one will take the place of that villain that is now, I want destroyed. I want somebody destroyed. Well, Jesus Christ will take that person's place, and that will disarm that venom. It'll be disarmed. So even where you have a tragic passage, later it's a later text will, in a sense, resolve it. So I think just let the text speak and let it win its way with you step by step.
One of the distinctions that that Lewis makes in his book on criticism is the distinction between receiving and using a text. And to him, it's very important that we receive the text. That's his comment about the first demand of any work of art makes upon us is surrender. And I was really interested in your own journey when you said you at Berkeley with fellow students were reading as amateurs. And you said even when you went to Princeton, you were still reading as an amateur. You were studying over here in the seminary, but you still were able to approach the text as an amateur. As one becomes more theologically trained, is it more difficult to receive the text without preset expectations? You know, Lewis says in an experiment in criticism, we are so busy doing things with the work that we give it too little chance to work on us.
Yes.
And he says, therefore, it's like a mirror. We read and we meet only ourselves. That seems to me to be a challenge.
It is. I think, and really, experiment in criticism, probably better than anything I've ever read, helps you as an anecdote for that. That's his serious man that plays football, the serious person who reads the text because I'm looking for something there that I have to preach on Sunday. That is deadly for a pastor. The pastor who's trying to find something to support, I'm going to preach on racism now, so I got to find a text to support the theme I'm trying to make. So now I'm not receiving the text. I'm using it to make a point that I've already decided I'm going to make. And the pastor that does this begins to not listen to the text or let it flow over him or even allow himself to be bothered by a text because he's already decided, I am going to go this way with this material, and then I'm not receiving it, I am using it. I'm using it for a point that I've already got in my head that I want to make. I think that's very dangerous, and I think that's the best anecdote is Lewis himself in this book, Experiment in Criticism.
But how have you avoided that? Because when you were at Berkeley, you were a mere mortal.
Yeah.
Now you're a pastor.
Yeah.
There's a big difference. When you were a student at Berkeley and you were receiving the text and reading it with these other students, you were all on a level playing field. You didn't know Greek. You didn't know Hebrew. You hadn't read Karl Barth. You didn't have a theological, systematic theology. So you could just come to the text and read it with them. How do people do that with someone in the group like yourself who is knowledgeable on these things, and they just want to ask you, what does this mean? You know, how do you keep that freshness?
Yeah, I would think, well, one thing I love about a small group of guys that, or men and women that are reading a text together, where if it's proper to say the more mature student who's reading the material and has read it before and has studied the language and tries to know it, but then still, if you can allow the freshness of a person that's coming at it for the first time and allow that freshness to break into the meeting without it being immediately anesthetized or immediately controlled, allow it to come into the room, you'll get a breakthrough often because, let's face it, the text it's real stuff. It's really happening. It's things that are happening. And sometimes the fresh, earthy understanding of something that's really happening may be better than maybe having thought through scholarly implications of it too much.
Describe the mechanics of this. You walk in, they walk in, you're going to do a text. Does everybody read a verse and then everybody talk about it? Are you teaching and then stopping for their comments at this point and when you were at Berkeley as a student?
Well, you know, I've developed a kind of an approach to small groups discussion and study that I think is valid, and that is, and I've used this through the years, and not just with Bible study, this is a great same approach to use in reading a book like The Brothers Karamazov, or reading a book like Experiment in Criticism or Screwtape Letters. First, you have a group, you ask someone to be the reader, so that I was never the reader. You ask some, and then some people say, no, I don't read well. I don't like, so you don't want anybody embarrassed. But there's always somebody that likes to read. Then let that person be the reader. And in every Bible study I've always been in, it's always been this way. And it's been fun to have the reader read. And then if you're the leader of that group, or someone is playing the lead role, the lead person basically only has to do one thing. The reader reads, and the leader stops the reader and says, okay, stop there. And then it's open. How did you feel about this text? What did you think was happening? This is now to everyone. And then, of course, always the W questions: why, what, when, where, who. All those questions can be asked about anything, just inductive questions. What's going on here? Why is it here? What are we seeing here? But ask the group to reflect on what they see. That's what Lewis is saying there. What do you see there? And that's where a brand new observer, maybe the freshest observer of a true event that's occurring, because they see something that the others maybe didn't see. Yeah. And that, by letting somebody be the reader, stopping the reader at a certain point, maybe they read a sentence, okay, let's stop there. And then, okay, folks, what do we see? What's happening here? And then reflect. And when the reflections come, now, I don't think you should suppress knowledge you do know. If you have made a discovery, say, about words, and of course, some people are better linguistically prepared that way, they can then help the group by saying, this word is a fascinating word.
What about commentaries?
I like Lewis's point. In fact, it's in Screwtape, it's in the Experiment, where he says, tell me what the hard words mean, and you've done more for me than 1,000 commentaries. Now, why is he against commentaries? He isn't against them, but he has another line in that same section where he says, I try to with students, I urge them not to express finalized opinions too soon. Yeah. Defer opinion as long as possible, and watch the words, watch it unfold. But I urge students not to express opinions too soon.
Well, and here's the other interesting thing. This book is written, he's been a professor at Oxford, now he's at Cambridge. And so he's seen a lot of students. And he observes that if you ask students to read Shakespeare, what they'll do when they're asked to write a paper about it is they will not give you their encounter with Shakespeare. They will constantly be referencing what scholars have said about Shakespeare. And he said, that's not what I'm interested in. I'm interested in the student encountering the story and the text. I want to know what the student thinks about it. I'm not interested in them coming in with and isn't it true that education has really often become that? All of my friends that went on and got PhDs I've been in 2 PhD programs, didn't finish either of them, thanks be to God. And with all due respect for those of you that did that work, but all of my friends with PhDs, once they got their newly minted PhD, when I would sit down and talk with them, I felt like I was talking to a librarian, because they were constantly referencing, because that's what they had to do in their thesis. They had to reference all the body of work that's been done on this. And Lewis was really fighting against that. And I think it's very applicable when we think about Bible study and churches, is that if a Bible study degenerates into, well, John Calvin said and so said, and you get away from the story and the text, Lewis is saying you've departed from the actual purpose. The text was written for you to read it, not for you to learn all of the different interpretations that scholars throughout the centuries. But that does bring us to an interesting question, which is when you talk about expository preaching, it means understanding what these verses mean at its simplest level. But when you talk about exegesis, you're talking about often today understanding the historical and grammatical and linguistic issues so that you're understanding what that text meant in the first century. So In what sense is that knowledge about the original context important or not important as a person's reading the text? And how do you keep that from getting off track with reading the text? For instance, if you take the subject of women wearing head coverings in 1 Corinthians, well, you and I and many people here have studied it and know what the historical context was for that. Would you bring that in? Do you use that sparingly? How do we wrestle with what I believe Lewis is saying, which is read the text. Don't reference all of this other stuff. But he also understood literature and history of literature, and he had read all the texts.
Yeah, he would not be arguing against following a lead. If a text stirs you up to want to pursue a lead, like why is Paul upset about the jewelry of the women in Corinth?
Yeah.
And then, okay, I think that is very, very good to urge a student to pursue that lead. And any book, Will Durant's book on the age of Greece, will be a way, and he's not even a Christian, but he can help you pursue that situation in Corinth and the temple of Aphrodite at Corinth, and the reasons why Paul is concerned about the women being put upon by the sailors that are there because of all those temptations. And so I think it's great when in a Bible study, a person gets literally so intoxicated with the fact that there's so much material here that is so good, but there are leads that I'm urged to pursue, like the meaning of words. It's just fascinating to watch the use of words and the use of language and how it. And of course, you want to know what would it have meant when it was first used. It's useful to read and do some research, and students can be without in any way contamination. You're not contaminating the text when you try to understand the historical setting of the text. And I think that is the value of a commentary. A great commentary helps you to understand historical setting, and I'm for that. But yet, when you're in that study, be sure you let the text speak, and then and let it bother you, and let it resolve you, and let it do all these things.
Do you usually go through a whole book, or do you do selected passages?
No, I think there's something very good about letting a text or a book unfold its whole way, rather than to pick favorites that you maybe have favorite sections, but then you omit everything else. Just go through it.
Yeah.
And I think there's something really exciting about a group of men and women that are letting a book make its whole mark on you as best you can.
But for instance, this morning I was on the ferry, and at the beginning of this year, I distributed a read through the Bible schedule. That if you want to read through the Bible in a year, you can read it through it in this. And it goes back and forth between Old and New Testament, and it has Psalms and Proverbs throughout it. So it's a kind of a mixture, but you're going to have read the entire Bible at the end of the year. There was a wonderful couple on the ferry this morning, and she said, I took your advice, and I'm really struggling. And I said, why? And she said, I just finished Numbers. No, I just did a memorial service Saturday for Rosa Montgomery. She was Billy Graham's late wife, Ruth Graham Bell's sister. Born in China. She's the last remaining child of
L. Nelson Bell.
Yeah, L. Nelson Bell. And she was an amazing Bible teacher, and she definitely did not allow people to bring commentaries to her Bible study. It was, let's interpret the Bible from within the Bible. And so I told this woman this story. I said, you know, Rosa said the reason she didn't leave any scriptures to be read at her memorial service is she loves them all. And I said, one time Rosa gave me a little crocheted cross from China. And I said, so I stuck it in the book of Leviticus to remind me when I'm reading Leviticus that Rosa loved every verse in the Bible. Now, I've had theological training, so when I read texts, I have a way of at least getting a context and so forth. I think it's very difficult for people to approach the text when some of the texts bring a level of obscurity, or I agree completely with what you said about the distinction between biblical theology and systematic theology. But for a person that knows the new story and can put the old story in the context of it, that's a different exercise than for somebody that's sitting down for the very first time and reading this story.
Yeah.
So how does that fit Lewis saying just receive the text?
Yeah. Well, and in that case, receive it and say, I'm baffled by it. Why not say you're baffled?
Yeah.
Or I wonder why so much of that's here.
Yeah.
Hey, that's all right too.
Yeah.
See, why is I think it's good to say what things kind of not necessarily baffle. I use the word baffle. Like when you get to Hebrew poetry and realize it's highly repetitious. And we're in a Greek tradition where we like things not to be as repetitious. We like a point made, and then we like to have the point and then move on to something else. But if you're reading Hebrew poetry, and like Book of Proverbs and many of the Psalms, highly repetitious, because, all right, that's not what I'm used to, but I'm going to still let it flow over me. See, it's sort of like when you're in a novel that has got parts that you're not really into, but you're letting it flow over you. That doesn't mean you're loving it all the same. I wouldn't agree with Rosa that I would love every single part the same. But I
don't think she said she loved them the same.
Okay,
she loved
good.
Every verse in the Bible.
She's glad they're there.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
So one more question, then we'll take a break and get to the audience questions. And by the way, I love the approach that you've taken from the beginning through to now, because I think one of the greatest things is when people do read the text, receive the text, and I think Doug Stewart and Gordon Fee suggest that you put in your margin A for I agree with this, D for I disagree with this, and question mark, I don't get this at all. But then when a person does that, they need a place to go and discuss it.
Yeah.
And to be able to discuss it with people together who are on this journey together, to have somebody who does know a little bit more than everybody else, or even quite a bit more, but is able to lead it in a way that doesn't remove from them the opportunity to receive the text fully. Yeah. It's a real gift that you have. And I think it's a great, great thing for all of us to think about as we think about it, our own Bible studies. But the one thing that Lewis says in this book is he's making a distinction between a literary person and an unliterary person. He's making a distinction between the ways that people read. But then he makes this comment that he realizes that the majority of people don't read, or they only read when they have nothing else to do, when it's the last remaining option. And it seems to me that he wrote this in 61, right? With the advent of television and electronic media and the web and everything else, it's more that way now than ever. So what is the realistic prospect that people are actually still going to read the Bible, study the Bible, when we seem to be moving away from a culture that reads?
Well, yes, I think we should be alarmed at the lack of reading by youth and all, but on the other hand, be grateful whenever there is a break in the dike. And like the Harry Potter series created a break in the dike for boys, and boys started reading. And I was grateful for that. And many of the Lewis books have, and certainly Lord of the Rings, has roped in a lot of male readers because the books just simply did that. And I think the Bible has its own way of roping you in by where you actually do take a text and let it kind of flow over you, and limit the time when you're doing it, like Dostoevsky says, have a time, but let it flow over you, and then reflect on it and see what you have a right to trace what is nourishing and what's baffling and what you have questions about. And that even gets you stirred up all the more to want to talk it over with somebody else. And before you know it, you're literate. And before you know it, you're enjoying it with others.
this is great, and I can't wait to hear your questions. Now we get to the really good stuff. This is Dick Staub. You're listening to the Kindlings Muse at Earl Palmer. We're talking about how to study the Bible, and we're looking at it through the lens of C.S. Lewis's classic book, An Experiment in Criticism. We'll be back right after this.
Thank you, everybody. This is Dick Staub, and you're listening to the Kindling Muse at Earl Palmer Ministries, and we're having an amazing conversation tonight, and it's going to get even more exciting because we're going out into the highways and byways, out to what is called the hoi polloi, and going to find out the kinds of questions that have been on your mind tonight, and we're going to start with Larry.
Dr. Palmer, I remember back when you were preaching at University of Presbyterian Church, and oftentimes part of your sermons were defining words and terms. And oftentimes I remember that the definitions would be quite a bit different or somewhat different than the way I had interpreted them. And so it would give me a different understanding of the text that you were talking about. So I know that there are Bibles that have versions that attempt to translate the text into more contemporary verbiage. And I'm wondering if you would recommend those types of texts to, say, the novice or someone who doesn't have your grasp of the explanation of some of the...
Well, you know, I think I always say to anyone, the first good clue to being attentive to words and language would be to get several translations available to you. And that's quite easy now because they're all available. Like the King James Bible is always valuable because that's an old translation, but it's marvelous. It didn't have some of the later manuscripts that were later discovered that were even older manuscripts than the Alexandrinus manuscript that is there at King James. But their word choices were sometimes very marvelous and earthy. Then you've got the RSV, you've got the New RSV, you've got the NIV, you've got the Jerusalem Bible, which is the Catholic version. You've got a whole host of these translations. And by putting them alongside of each other, especially if you're doing a Bible study with about 6 people, it's great if there can be about 2 or 3 different translations. And you get to a word where you're wondering what that word it seems to be an important word. How does the RSV handle that word? How does the King James handle that word? That alone can often be a great alert. And then, of course, there are books that do help you actually study the Greek or Hebrew words that are there. And that's one role that a commentary is supposed to play.
Is there a study Bible that you would recommend over others that, for instance, has the Revised Standard Version text, but then does do footnotes on word studies particularly?
The Oxford Annotated RSV has got the most apparatus of any book, of any New Testament and Old Testament that's there. That's the Oxford University, what they call expanded with the full, and it even has the apocryphal books because it's Roman Catholic is approved. That's the RSV or New RSV, and you get the Oxford Annotated, or you can get the Harper Annotated. Those annotated translations have what they call the apparatus at the bottom of the page, and they will alert you to a lot of word, you might say word choices that translations have made. That's one clue. And the other is if you want to learn Greek, of course, and that's not an impossible language to learn, but then you can get an interlineary. You can get actually the Greek text with the English text alongside of it, and you can see the words, and sometimes they'll even alert you to a lexicon that will then give you translations of the word. That's a little more complicated. Then you really need to know the Greek and Hebrew. But a lot of people learn Greek for that reason. They said, it is a fascinating language, and so is Hebrew, and they both can be learned.
Yeah. Kevin, what's your question?
So I like to read, but the Bible isn't written by Tom Clancy or J.K. Rowling.
It isn't?
How do you get past the density of the Bible to let it wash over you?
Yes. Well, now, okay, that's a very good question. There are ways in which the Bible it becomes more, you might say, user accessible. And one way, but you still have to be alert now to this, is to get what we'd call a free translation. The best I know of is Eugene Peterson's translations of the New Testament, and he's done now numerous Old Testament ones too. For one thing, his knowledge of the Greek language and of Hebrew is superb. But he'll do what a translation that's an authorized translation can't do. An authorized translation is supposed to give you one word for one word. That is the tradition of what you might call official translation, one word for one word. But he isn't bound by that. He can give you 4 or 5 words to give you what he thinks is the flavor. Like he'll have his wonderful way of saying that Christ dwelt among us. He says he's moved into our neighborhood. That's the way he handles that. Well, that's not what the text says. It doesn't say he moved into our neighborhood. But that dwelt among us, he says the sense of it is he's moved into our neighborhood. And I think Eugene Peterson, by all means, is the best. But in my opinion, Eugene Peterson should not be used as an authorized Bible study translation pure. You should have it as a fun variation on the text. It's like the variation on a melody that can be there to help you understand the sense. But yet still try to do a Bible study insofar as possible with an authorized one word for one word. So that you then all have like NIV or RSV and all, and then use Eugene Peterson on the side.
Eugene Peterson, I think most of you know, is a Seattle Pacific University graduate. And yeah, I hear some SPU folks here. And his message, Bono read it and said it brought the text alive. And he called Eugene Peterson and asked him to come and meet with U2 after a concert. So Eugene Peterson and his wife went to this concert with Bono. And Bono's a poet. He loves words. And he loved the way, because he already loves Scripture. But just as Earl said, it just brought it alive in a new way to him. And that's what that kind of text can do. But you do need to keep it rooted in the actual text. Beth, what's your question?
Hi, Earl. I think you answered part of this, but I will give it a try. Given your 1 hour ideal time for a Bible study, have you also discovered an ideal size for this group so that each member's questions and ideas are formulated and aired?
Yeah, well, even Dostoevsky was helpful there. He said, invite them into your, I said home. Actually, in the text, it's your hut. Invite them in your hut. They won't make too much of a mess, he says. But in other words, he's already giving you a clue. He's not talking about a vast assembly. He's talking about a group of people where they can see each other's faces and they can see each other's expressions and get a feeling for what each other are thinking. I think 8, 9 is the upper limit. 7, 6, 5, 3, 2. I mean, sometimes people don't show up, and then you're down to 4. That's great. But I think the fact there is a dynamic of having more than 2. Then the 3 gives you another dynamic. 4 gives you another dynamic. 5 another dynamic. And I think all those dynamics have their own value. But when you get to 1,000, it's a different story.
David, what's your question?
Does your approach, let it flow, lead to lots of disagreement about interpretation, especially comparing life and society in the 1st century versus the 21st century?
Yeah, that's a very thoughtful question because you want to try to be sensitive to the way a 1st century context, a 1st century person would hear it. And I think that's where there is value in knowing the 1st century setting and 1st century use of a word, say. But then I think it's very important to realize that you then need to play what I would call the role of the discipleship role, the theological role of saying, okay, now what is the truth that transcends the time constraint and now becomes completely relevant to me in this century where we have different settings. Let me give you one. You're a doctor, I know, and I'll tell you this one example. You know, our mutual friend, Dr. Greer, invited me to come to do a grand round, I think, at the University Hospital. And he asked me to give a Bible study there. And so I did a Bible study from Philippians where Paul says that when you see, he says, I want you to stand and compete together, not. And then the RSV says, not frightened by your opponents. Well, I was talking to these doctors, and I said, the word there is pturo in Greek. Now, I know the Greek. They don't know it. That's when, now there's a place where I did use a knowledge that I knew. And I'm very interested in words. And I was especially interested in pturo. We get the English word terror from that word, because pturo is only used in that one spot in the whole New Testament. And Paul uses the word there, not. And the RSV translates it, not frightened. But the problem is there's so many other words for fear in the New Testament, like phobeo, phobia, which is a common word for fear, and then trauma, which means tremble. But then there's this word, pturo. And then I went into the lexicon. Now here's where the lexicon, the Greek lexicon, because those scholars have done all this work on the language, they show you the way the word was used in classical Greek. Now, in this case, it's interesting to see how it was used in classical Greek, not just because it's not used in the New Testament anywhere except here. And I discovered that in classical Greek, the word pturo was used primarily to describe animals not being startled. And it's not, and so the proper read, it should have been not startled. Not startled, not panicked, in other words, by this. And then he says, that's a good sign, Paul then goes on to say, that's a good sign that you're going to survive. So I gave that Bible study, and you know, a doctor called me up the next week and said, can you write that word down for me, pturo? I want to put it in my desk. Not pturo, not startled. I mean, it's the key in medicine, is to not panic. And the worst word in medicine is if a doctor says, oops. You know, I don't want him to say that, you know. I don't want him to say that. I don't want him to be startled. I want him and that's a good sign when you're not startled. And you know, that's the word Paul uses. And so the RSV led you astray when it said not afraid. He's not saying don't be afraid. He says don't be startled. Hey, take it in stride. Keep your sanity. And that'll be a good sign. So I did that Bible study, and it's funny, this doctor said, would you give me that word? I'm going to put it in my desk. Because so he took the word and immediately brought it way into our century. Because it's applicable in our century. And I think that's where Lewis's inspiration to me, tell me what the hard words mean. And you've done more for me than 1,000 commentaries. And in that case, I think knowing what that word means to a person that would have heard it in the first century does more than if I just simply say, don't be afraid. He's not saying don't be afraid.
Yeah. Pam, what's your question?
Lewis says, no poem will give up its secret to a reader who enters it regarding the poet as a potential deceiver and determined not to be taken in. We must risk being taken in if we are to get anything.
Isn't that great?
Would you say that in reading the Bible, Lewis would say a skeptic or a non-believer will get nothing if he reads the Bible? Or would he may say that perhaps he is risking just by reading the word?
Yeah. Well, he would not say that you can't be skeptical and have questions and raise questions. He's talking about a poem in that section won't release its secret to you unless you risk the poem. And I think there is a great truth in that. You get to a certain point in studying the Bible. You get to a certain point where you're hearing about God's faithfulness. And you're hearing about the fact you can trust his faithfulness. And you know, You will never get beyond just knowing what all the words mean until you actually put your weight down and do trust his faithfulness. And that then fits into that line. The secret is discovered when you risk it. And so I think that goes with Bible study too, but that goes in science, it goes into everything. You've got to risk a discovery to get the secret. And I think that's one of the most beautiful parts of Spearmint and Criticism when he tells that little parable.
But that's what Lewis said. You can't be too careful about what you're going to read.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I think that's a good approach with somebody that doesn't know the faith, is say, read this book, but beware. Because a lot of amazing people have kind of gotten shocked by what's in there.
Yeah.
Bob, what's your question?
To what extent is it possible for us to actually get ourselves out of the way and let Scripture speak for itself? And how can we increase the likelihood of being successful in that?
Yeah, how do you get yourself out of the way? Boy, that is such a wonderful thing if it can happen, that you can, in effect, not be so conscious about how I'm coming across or how people are respecting me or honoring me in some role I see myself in this room. Just maybe that's where kids are very good to have around, because they tend to puncture balloons of pride and too much self-awareness. They tend to level you a little bit. Like my grandkids have said to me the other day, and it's the truth, but I've never wanted to particularly hear it too much. But my grandson said to me the other day, he says, "Papa, you're shrinking." Well, I'm not really shrinking. I am shrinking because my dad got shorter and shorter. But he's getting taller. That's the big thing. He's almost 6 feet tall.
Comfort
and so he said,
with that
he says, "Papa, you're shrinking." And kids are marvelous that way. They kind of level the ground. And I think that's where youth are great to have around, because they do level and help you to get yourself out of the way and just then drink it in. But that's where the appetite for adventure and the appetite for excitement and discovery is one way to get yourself out of the way. I think that's why Lewis used the soccer illustration. The serious man who plays soccer, or the serious soccer player. Try to be the serious soccer player, and kids will help you be that. Then you're getting yourself out of the way. You're not, and when you're playing a game, don't look up to see if the scouts are watching you. Just play the game. That should be a good word to every basketball player too. Don't look and see what universities are checking me out now. Just play, and you'll do far better.
Actually, Bob, one of the things that I've learned is my grandmother became a Christian. She was 15, and she committed herself to reading through the Bible at least once a year. And I inherited her Bible when she died at 91. And she had marked down, and many years she read the Bible 3 times in a year. But I find that if you read a different version each year, it does give you a fresh way of approaching the text, because it's like you're reading it for the first time. Yeah. And there's so many good ones out there that can be really useful. Jim, what's your question?
Well, you've sort of answered this already maybe, but don't we need to understand the historical cultural context in which the Bible was written? And for example, the letters of Paul would have heard very differently to the intended audience than how we hear them in the 21st century. And that seems a bit counter to this idea that just letting the text flow over us.
Well, and it's a bit threatening to a layperson who hears good preaching that draws out the historical context, and they can walk away from that and say, you can't really understand this book unless you know the first century, because after all, it was written to the first century.
Yeah, and I would say no. In fact, didn't you love that Dostoevsky also nailed that? He said, "Don't worry, they will figure it out." They can figure it out. It is so true. When something is so genuinely true and to the core, it can break through even the facades of cultural, you might say, isolation. And it's amazing how that's true. That's why when you come into contact with real love, it communicates and it breaks through. And that's what I think is what Dostoevsky is making that point. It will come through. The priests say, we don't have the time to do it. Don't worry, just do it, even if you give it an hour. And don't worry, those Lutherans are not going to rob your flock. Just do it, and they will understand it. And I think that confidence in the power of the text, the Bible is very powerful. And of course, we do believe that the Holy Spirit is involved in communicating eternal truth to us too. Yeah. And we have to believe that.
David, what's your question?
Is it fair to say that the book of Revelations and its meaning was written for the first century church?
Yeah, the book of Revelation, there's an example of the more you understand and get your hands around the cultural terror that they were facing. Nero is definitely the emperor during the time of the book of Revelation. That's why I do not believe it was written during Domitian's persecution at the end of the century. It makes a big difference at what part of the century you put the book of Revelation. And if it's written after the fire of Rome, after 64 AD, which is what I believe, before the fall of Jerusalem, before Jerusalem's been destroyed, because the destruction of Jerusalem is not even hinted at or mentioned in the book of Revelation. And it was a cataclysmic event. Josephus wrote a whole book about it, the Jewish Wars. It's not even mentioned. But what is mentioned is the persecution after the fire of Rome. And knowing that, and then realize, I think one of the best helps in reading Revelation was when I read a layman's commentary on it, Jacques Ellul, who was a lawyer in France who wrote one of the best commentaries on Revelation. And he just made the point, it's a book about power, good power and bad power, but it's pointing out that the good power of the Lamb is greater and more durable than the bad power of Nero or of the devil, of course. Their power is bad power, but it's not. You don't have to fear it because the last word belongs to the Lamb. That is the simplest message in the whole Bible. Really, is the book of Revelation that the Lamb holds history in His hands. Now it's terrifying because the history that surrounds us is terrifying, but the Lamb holds history in His hands, and He wins. So. Yes, the cultural setting is important, but you know, it's funny. Hans Lilja is the other great writer of a commentary on Revelation, and he wrote it in a Nazi prison camp. And he said, people who suffer do not play with the book of Revelation. People who don't suffer play with the book. Wow. And it was Hans Lilja, the great German pastor, who said, people who suffer have been comforted by this book. They don't play games with it and try to figure out, is this the European common market? Is this China? And is this Russia? Don't play that game. Yeah. It's about power and good power, and the good power is winning. And it's funny, you don't play games with it. And sometimes you have to stand back before the imagery and say, I don't know what it's getting at. That's okay. You can feel it. That's why I call chapter 6 to 22, I call it the symphonic part of the book. It's more symphonic than it is choral. But the choral parts are perfectly clear. I'll tell that to you next month. But anyway.
Matt, what's your question?
Are there any texts or type of texts that might be destructive for a Christian or any person to withhold judgment or suspend judgment and simply let the text wash over them?
Yes, let it wash over you, and then that doesn't mean you don't think about it. You're letting it wash over you, and then you're trying to think about it. And it is true that here's Luther's great principles. Texts need to be arranged in terms of their proximity to the core, to what is at the heart, to what they mostly point to. And they mostly point to the amazing grace that where sin increased, the grace of God increased more. Okay, that is Romans 5. If you take a great line and a great organizing truth, and that's a kind of an organizing truth. In fact, chapter 5 of Romans is probably the organizing truth of the entire book of Romans. Now, if you then let all these passages that could be potentially dangerous if you misinterpreted them, and then you see how close they are to the center, and then you have to make a value judgment. And see, now in some cases you have to say, I have to defer judgment on this to figure out more information. I've got to get more material. I've got to get more witness to surround the question I have with regard to this text.
Matt, were you referring to like extra biblical texts, novels, fiction, things that are out there that may have be perceived as being violent or not having any? Yeah, occult. Yeah. He's talking about, are there books that you actually
you're talking about not the Bible itself necessarily.
Yeah.
But yes, you've got a lot of cultic material that is sometimes features itself as building upon biblical material, but it's not. It really isn't. And it's very alarming sometimes, especially some of the material that begins to have a strong prophetic element to it and begins to give kind of prophetic predictions. Be very, very suspicious and careful and say, I need more information. And then I've got to, again, use Luther's principle. I've got to get it to its center, to the center teaching and how it jibes with that. And that will sometimes become self-corrective.
Yeah. Lewis actually is applying, the experiment in criticism is specifically about literature, but he does apply it to all the arts. And I've always wished, I knew his stepson, Douglas Gresham, and Gresham went to Fantasia with C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis saw Fantasia, and he had some comments about Walt Disney and his understanding of mythology. And I've really wished that he was around to update this chapter for film, because I think that's another place where people are asking, are there films I shouldn't be watching? Are there films that have no redeeming value? And Lewis's argument seems to imply, how can you know if it has no redeeming value if you haven't seen it? You know, and yet there's so many reviewers out there of books and of film, and we have so little time in life. I kind of look at it as meat offered to idols. I have the liberty to read, watch anything, but I have to use my time wisely, you know, and I'm not going to consume everything I could consume. I'm going to make choices. What's your question tonight, Ken?
Dr. Palmer, when suggesting that someone read the Bible, what is the best way to help them focus on the center, that is Christ, and yet still let the text wash over them?
Yes. Well, of course, I was making what I would just call a procedural observation, that when you read, starting the Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, any of the Gospels, when you read anything in the New Testament, you're reading witness to the heart of the text, and the text without any kind of I don't have to do maneuvering. It just simply draws you to what is the center point, and that center point is a person, Jesus Christ himself. Now it's a little more subtle in the Old Testament. The Old Testament, you notice I said, by anticipation, points you to its living center. And I even gave a weird illustration of it. Even the grim reaper passages in the Old Testament do draw you to the Lord because, for instance, the passages that want the massacre of people in order to fulfill justice, then Jesus Christ comes along and he is massacred to fulfill justice. It's not that the others aren't massacred. Nero's not massacred. Pontius Pilate's not massacred. It's Jesus Christ who is massacred. He's the one who's humiliated to fulfill. And even the Old Testament anticipated this in Isaiah 53. All we like sheep have gone astray, and the Lord hath laid on him the iniquity of us all. And that's amazing anticipation. But it's also anticipated in Psalms. It's anticipated. And then, so that even the grim reaper passages have a way. Bonhoeffer made a big point of this in one of his works on the Old Testament. That in an amazing way, they point to the center, who is in the New Testament made crystal clear, and so you don't have to do any maneuvering to have that happen. It just happens. Now, of course, that's my own interpretation of the reading. You have a right to say, well, okay, I'm going to read it, and I'm going to end up, I'm fascinated with John the Baptist. Well, but you're not really. John the Baptist himself, when you're fascinated with him, he says, I can't tie his shoelace. See, even John the Baptist forces you to look at Jesus Christ, though he's the most fascinating person in the New Testament apart from Jesus. It's certainly John the Baptist. But notice, even he points you to Jesus Christ.
We have 4 more questions. We're going to try to get them out there quickly and be finished. Lori, what's your question?
Oh, yes. Earl. I forget. Sorry, I got blank. Okay. Could you explain Lectio Divina and your experience of it, please?
Yeah, the devotional reading of Scripture, that it goes way back in antiquity, especially in the Roman Catholic tradition. I think also in Greek Orthodoxy, many of the orders had the kind of reading that was done in the monasteries, and it's being done now. You said that you go to one in Bellevue Presbyterian Church where there's the reading and then prayer and then personal application to what you read quite quickly. But in a meditative, I think it's marvelous. And I'm glad that that is another way in which biblical literacy is happening for people in a very personal way.
Mike, you had a question.
Yeah, I think it's been answered in many different ways. What do you do with non-believers who have problems with the Old Testament? I mean, there's a lot of bad, horrible stories there, and they say, well, how can God allow this to happen? Yeah. So, I mean, like you say, it all points to Christ.
Yeah. And, of course, the one thing that's going for us there is that when you say it points to Christ in the most amazing and healing way. I wish I could exactly quote Bonhoeffer, but he has this he says, it's in his letters and papers in prison, it's only when you see the sword hanging over your foe and he is about to be killed, that then you can understand what the redeeming presence of Jesus Christ is, who takes the place of your foe. He takes the place of David's enemy. He takes the place of the take the false prophets of Asherah and the false prophets that were slain by Elijah. Isn't it interesting that after Elijah saw the 400 false prophets killed and the 420 false prophets of Asherah killed, he went into depression. It's after that. He won, and then he went into depression. And even that prepares you for a victory where you don't have to go into depression after the victory.
Bill, what's your question?
Earl, first thing, I'd like to tell you that your word studies have been a blessing in my life. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Bill.
My question was, when we start collecting these 4 or 5 top versions, we've mentioned the King James, the RSV, the new RSV. Is that it? I mean, are those the Earl's recommended study Bible?
There's so many. Ronald Knox, for instance, a Roman Catholic, he was a good friend of Cardinal Newman, wrote a beautiful translation of the New Testament. Again, he has interpretations of texts that are just totally blow your mind. They're so wonderful. And I think the Jerusalem Bible is one of the fine, quite unique translations, and a very beautiful one. The ASB, American Standard Version, J.B. Phillips did a translation. It's old now, but it's still good. I try to collect them all. And it's amazing how I make use of them. James Moffat wrote a translation of the Bible. It's again quite remarkable. So you've got those are old, and now there's new ones coming out all the time too that are there, and we're just grateful for it. I think that is one of the nice things that's happening and then as when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, it gave us again more insight into some Hebrew words that needed to be better understood, and then of course every archaeological find, manuscript discovery goes into the mix. And that's what's great about the new RSV and take, for instance, the new RSV, which is the latest translation that is really a great one, and get the Oxford Annotated, and their apparatus at the bottom of the page will alert you to all kinds of things that have been discovered that will help you with the text.
Last question.
Hey.
Lee, what's your question?
Earl, how do you personally handle passages that you have difficulty with?
That you've had to what?
Difficulty or that baffle you.
Yeah.
He's talking about you personally.
How do I personally do it? Well, sometimes I'll say, I don't know enough yet. I don't know enough yet to really conclude what is the full intent of this text. What is the full intent of the text? So especially, now that would be especially true when you see vengeance texts and things like that. What is the full intent? What is the final goal of this text? And what's going to happen, really? And there are texts. I wrote a commentary on the book of Revelation. There are texts in the book of Revelation that you have to simply stand back and say, I'm just one wonders. For instance, the lake of fire references. But there's nobody in the lake of fire. They're at the edge of the lake of fire. Okay. Is there still a chance for people to repent after they die? There are passages that seem to say yes, some seem to say no. You have to leave it in abeyance. And I got a C.S. Lewis quote that covers it. There's a whole area of things you have to say, I don't know what the future holds, but I know who holds the future. And then Lewis has this great line, you might as well leave the future, and this is usually those troublesome passages have to do with things that have a future aspect to them. You might as well leave the future in God's hands. It's there whether you leave it or not. And that was one of Lewis's great lines. It's not just a cop-out, but it just shows you need a kind of restraint on quickly rushing in with an interpretation that you later realize, hey, it was too partial, it was too incomplete, it didn't have enough information yet to really make it.
Well, this has been another fascinating discussion tonight. Earl, thank you so much for your comments. I was reminded here at the end of Mark Twain's famous comment, it's not what I don't understand about the Bible that bothers me, it's what I do understand about the Bible that bothers me. And Lewis, in his Experiment in Criticism, is putting a big emphasis on the responsibility of the reader. He says, in order to pronounce a book bad, it is not enough to discover that it elicits no good response from me, for that might be my fault. So he's asking us all to be fair with the text, open to the text, listen to the text. It's a great piece of advice. This is Dick Staub. You've been listening to the Kindling's Muse at Earl Palmer Ministries. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll look forward to seeing you again next time.